Today, we're going to look at what is probably a different topic to cover in a course like this, um, but it'll become a bit clearer as we go. The spiritual discipline of pilgrimage. Um, we're going to talk about developing an intimacy with God in a way that our culture doesn't normally think about developing that intimacy with a discipline that sadly isn't really practiced in very many Christian traditions at all. We're going to look at what a pilgrimage theology might be, and then talk a bit about the discipline of pilgrimage, move into uh, traveling well, and then we're going to explore an image of pilgrimage uh, and see what sorts of spiritual lessons we can come away with from meditating on that image. From the very first, it appears that Christians were referred to as the people of the way. The book of Acts records that the followers of the way appears to be the first epithet that was used of Christians. And it was meant to refer to discipleship, that disciples followed Jesus. So they are people, followers of the way of Jesus. Christian pilgrimage, as the discipline of the way, has more to do with an approach to life than it does with geography. Most of us, if we think about the discipline of pilgrimage at all, we think about medieval pilgrims. We think about people who make these journeys to shrines of the saints for healing. And there are a number of narratives that are part of Christian tradition that have this motif of pilgrimage built into them. Perhaps the two most popular, Dante's Divine Comedy and John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Dante's Divine Comedy is the journey that Dante makes through purgatory or through hell into purgatory and then finally into paradise. John Bunyan's record of Pilgrim is the spiritual journey of a Christian through the varieties of experiences that the pilgrim has in life. The slough of despondency, for example. Those two narratives have had a unique contribution to make to both Catholic spirituality and Puritan spirituality. Bunyan was a Baptist in England, and Dante, of course, was a medieval Renaissance Roman Catholic. For me, pilgrimage has taken the form of what I call wayward walking. Others might call it wanderlust, in which I take time to fellowship with the God who walks. That way of describing God is a way that Fred Herzog, who taught at Duke for a number of years, develops in his dogmatics. God walk. God is always on the move. And I, as a disciple, have a tendency to be lagging behind, uh, but my spirituality is always on the move too. Um, this primarily for me, pilgrimage for me has been about a way of life rather than geography. I don't really make pilgrimages to saints' shrines or to the relics of saints, um, but I do like to hike in the mountains. And hiking for me has become a spiritual discipline. It's a way of literally walking around the earth with God. Other pastors might do this, might observe the discipline of pilgrimage by walking around their communities. I've known some who literally walk their parish and pray for the houses that are on that trek. Um, there's a college president in a local East Tennessee university that does this at the start of the semester, leads a prayer walk around campus. Um, this discipline of learning to walk with God, I think, is a very liberating one because it frees us from the bondage to place and stuff, and it helps us to be good, to feel alive. But I also have to say that there's something to be said for a commitment to place. There's something to be said about pastors who observe this discipline uh, in their parish, who literally uh, do prayer walks through the parish. Um, Henry David Thoreau, I think, is probably the patron saint for walkers because he spent almost his entire life in the village of Concord, but yet um, he wrote that he traveled more. He traveled much in Concord. Um, there was this notion for Thoreau of being committed to a particular place and the beauty of the commitment to a particular place. I think there's something to be said for pastors who have a spirituality that is committed to a place. But I think there's also something to be said in that commitment to place of observing a discipline that allows you literally to walk with God. Another writer that I think of like this is Annie Dillard. Her book Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, a beautiful little book if you've never read it, observed that place, Tinker Creek, and the depth of almost a Franciscan or a Thomistic spirituality of place. If we're honest, the narrative of the New Testament is a narrative of pilgrimage, wherein God is always on a journey toward us in Jesus Christ. But that journey is always as a wayward child, one who likes to roam on their own. So Jesus is God's way of reaching out to us and coming to us and getting us back into communion with God and demonstrating that in the earnestness of reconciliation of a sinner. I think, for example, of Luke 15, which most of us think of as the parable of the prodigal son, or even the parable of the prodigal sons, one who left, one who stayed, but both who were very distant from the heart of their father. But I think of the father who literally jumps off the front porch and runs toward the son. Uh, that is a beautiful image of God in Jesus Christ. as a God who's already, always on the move. And so, built into the very heart of the Christian gospel is this notion of God's pilgrimage toward us. The discipline then of pilgrimage, I think, is actually actually has a very strong biblical base. The church fathers loved to read the book of Joshua Christologically, that is, to read the various movements in Joshua as movements of Jesus toward the world, and knocking down the walls of Jericho, for example, as shattering the stronghold of Satan, and the trip that Jesus makes into the world. Even in the New Testament, there is a rich tradition of describing Christians as resident aliens and pilgrims. This is not our home, as the old mountain hymn puts it. We're just a traveling through. I think there's something to be said for a spirituality that recognizes Christians are a people on the move. There are, of course, some really strong historical precedents for thinking about Christians as a people who are not at home here, that we are resident aliens. We live among these people as people of another land. Clement, for example, in addressing the church at Corinth, described them as a sojourning church, as a church that was on the move. Empress Helena, who's Constantine's mother, did a trip to the Holy Land in 326, where she established churches at these sacra loca, these sacred locations, these holy spots in the Holy Land. There's the Church of the Sepulchre. There's the Church of Gethsemane. There's all those churches that dot the Holy Land in these major places in the narrative of Jesus' life. Those are attributed to Empress Helena. The relic of the cross that exists, again, attributed to Helena's pilgrimage in the Holy Land. Of course, medieval pilgrims are the primary way that people will think of pilgrims, if they think of pilgrims at all. And we think of medieval pilgrims in terms of the veneration of saintly relics, in terms of the demands for penance that priests would sometimes tell penitents to travel to a certain location and express their repentance to a saint in order to receive reconciliation. There are even promises of miracles and healings. Interestingly enough, most of the historical narratives about pilgrims are women. Women who would take these trips in venerating the saints. We tend to think of them as men, but the reality is that most of them were women. So pilgrimage is built into particularly the medieval experience for women, women's spirituality. What we know as the rise of cathedrals in Europe is primarily attributed to these pilgrimages, the pilgrims, the medieval pilgrims. any number of those cathedrals arose because local Christians who couldn't make these major pilgrimages to the Holy Land, they or even to other holy spots like in Turkey or Syria or wherever, Egypt or wherever else. So these cathedrals arose as a way of allowing medievals to visit, particularly the relics of saints that would be housed at these cathedrals. And if you read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in high school, you know that to be true. Like that's the way Chaucer describes pilgrims as people who are on the trail to Canterbury. Um, if we stop and think about the way in which churches are connected to pilgrimages, that should open up some avenues for you to even practice this with your parish. For example, the Stations of the Cross. Those of you who observe the Stations of the Cross during Holy Week, that's a pilgrimage. Those of you who have labyrinths and allow your parishioners to engage in a spirituality of the labyrinth, that is a pilgrimage. It's important for us, I think, to recognize just how deeply ingrained this notion of pilgrimage is to Christians and to Christian spirituality. Now, granted, those of us in the Protestant traditions have also grown up with some very rich and deep, and I think even rightful, criticisms. For example, Henry VIII flat out forbade clergy from alluring people to practice a pilgrimage to any of the saints. Medieval Anglican, late medieval Anglican spirituality did not have a lot of room for pilgrimage. Those of us who've grown up, inherited our faith from the Anglican Church, already know this to be true, because pilgrimage is just simply not something that's thought of, and if it is, it's usually thought of as a Catholic excess, which is exactly how John Foxe, who was a Anabaptist and a Puritan, thought about these things. John Foxe, in his Book of the Martyrs, had a very deep hostility to the corruptions of the Roman papacy, including pilgrimage. So while I think there are strong historical precedents, I think there is also room to recognize that those precedents can lead to some excesses. And so if you're going to practice pilgrimage, if you're going to inherit that biblical notion of being a resident alien and a pilgrim, then it helps to think about those criticisms too. English Puritanism, interestingly enough, used the notion, the metaphor of pilgrimage as the metaphor for their theology and their spirituality. Richard Baxter, John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, John Flavel, they all made quite a big to-do about the biblical narratives of Abraham's journey, Israel's exodus, the sacred travels of the Magi, and some of the Psalms even have this motif built into them, the motif of pilgrimage, and Christ's journey into Egypt. Other New Testament texts like that Petrine text. The pilgrims, the Puritans had quite a bit to say about pilgrims, and there's a reason for that. You can see it in the journals of the people from Jamestown and the Plymouth settlers, because leaving oppression in Europe and coming to the United States, they were seeking this affinity to land that would allow them the religious liberty to worship as they saw fit. So there was something to early Americans still seeing the narratives that are built into the biblical text about pilgrimage and understanding their own lives through that prism. Jonathan Edwards even has a very famous sermon, The Christian Pilgrim, in which he describes the trip that Christians are on, this trip to heaven, as always ascending. It's leading us uphill. And we are constantly in the struggle to travel that way. In the 20th century, Karl Barth, in his Church Dogmatics, makes quite a bit about Jesus being the God who goes off into the far country, into the evils of society, and the humility that's expressed in that trip, in order to reconcile the world to Himself. That is, I believe wholeheartedly, that is the biblical text. I mean, that is the story of the New Testament. That God humbles Himself to walk our way. Not just literally to walk in the way that we walk, but to walk toward us. To walk into the world. The world that is not God and is not happy to be with God, is against God. There is something to be said about a God who's willing to walk into a foreign land in order to reconcile God's creation back to Himself. And I think that's the basis out of which the discipline of pilgrimage grows. This understanding that God is always on the move, and we are moving with God. In terms of pilgrimage today, what does it look like now? Well, with so much travel that we have, with the development of transoceanic travel, and with the development particularly of air flight, we can go just about anywhere. And Americans are nothing if not a people who love to vacation. So I think it behooves us to begin to think about our travels, not simply local but even distant, as a spirituality. What does a spirituality of movement look like? Pilgrimage, and I'm pretty insistent about this, is not for our justification. I think this is where the medievals had it wrong. The priest sends you on a trip not in order to be forgiven, but in order to be sanctified. Forgiveness has taken place, and it's out of that forgiveness we seek to journey in the world. Pilgrimage is a discipline that anyone can practice. It is not limited to the super spiritual people. Richard Foster makes a big deal about this, that God intends the disciplines, all of them, and there are a myriad of them. God intends the disciplines of the spiritual life to be for ordinary human beings, people who have jobs, who care for children, who wash dishes, and who mow lawns. So when we begin to think about what does a spirituality of pilgrimage, what does a spirituality of movement look like? For children, I mean, this is a great way of concretizing and and giving a physical narrative that they can understand about the Christian journey, the journey to heaven. For young adults and college students who take, these mission trips, um, instead of just a trip, this is a spiritual revival. This is a renewal. This is our sanctification. So when you begin to think about short-term missions, um, how does a discipline of pilgrimage influence the way in which your church practices those short-term mission trips? Those disaster mission trips where you send out a disaster team to go minister to tornado, hurricane victims. What does that mean as a Christian discipline? Again, pilgrimage is not about geography. It's not about where you go. It's about the experience of spiritual transformation. Oswald Chambers has a beautiful quote, in my utmost for his highest. The reality of God's presence is not dependent on one place, but only dependent upon the determination to set the Lord always before us. Where we're headed is toward God. Whether that's at the grocery store when we're going grocery shopping, or whether that's going to get your tires changed down at Pep Boys, where you're going is on a journey toward God. This is not your home. You are a pilgrim here. You are a resident alien, and you are constantly struggling, just like the disciples in the Gospels, to keep up. But where you go, God is there. Now, just that statement alone should open up a way of thinking about what you do on a daily basis. Where you go, what you do, where you are. Where is God in that moment? I said just a moment ago that, even if you're on your way to get your tires changed at Pep Boys, I did this a couple of days ago. I had that little light come on in the car that said, okay, it's now time. Your tire pressure is too low because, well, you've got some bald spots on your car, so you've got to get that taken care of. So I had to go down to Pep Boys to get the tires changed. And while I was there were two guys who were from out of town who had encountered some car problems. And, the ideal way to get yourself in pastoral conversations when you're not intending to get in pastoral conversations is to wear a dog collar. Because that identifies you just like, a UPS driver's outfit identifies them. Well, you wearing a dog collar, they know who you are and they know what you do. And so when you're out in public and people see your dog collar, inevitably things turn spiritual. It happens all the time. And I'm sort of accustomed to it now. Although I really do urge people, well, that's not the only reason I'm here. If there's other things you want to talk about, let's talk about those too. And these guys were from out of town, and they were strangers, and they didn't know where they were or what they were doing. And they had been at the Pep Boys for several hours trying to get their ball bearings off the wheels, and they were getting hungry. And the conversation had been spiritual for a little while, and finally one of them asked, "Where do you get some good catfish?" And so we had a conversation about the different kinds of restaurants there are. And of course they were thinking really short term. They were thinking, can we find a Captain D's, or can we find a Long John Silver's? And I said, well, where are you from? They said, North Carolina. And I said, well, if you're headed down 40 It's probably about 60 or 70 miles down the interstate. But as you're headed down 40 off the interstate for, 6 or 8 miles, there is a catfish farm where you will literally catch a catfish and they will scoop it up and they will cook it for you right there. And that made their day. And in that conversation, they made mine. Because I realized that, that's why I was there. Was to help them find, in what was a very rough day, just a wee little sliver of joy. Where we go, what we do, wherever we are, we're constantly trying to catch up. We're constantly looking for God. And you will find God in some very interesting places and in very interesting ways if you just keep a lookout. How do you think about your travels? How do you think about where you go and what you do? And how does what you think about where you're going affect the way in which you practice your pastoral care when you're going into the hospital? When you're walking into someone's kitchen through the back door? How do you conceive of where you're headed? Most of us don't stop and think about this. But pastors are a people on the move, particularly within a certain location. Most of us here will serve, whether it's called a parish or not is kind of up for debate. But most of us will have congregations which live within specific communities. How do you think about how you travel in that location? How do you think about what you do when you're on the move? There is one way of thinking about movement and its connection to prayer, and that is to actually walk a labyrinth, to take a labyrinth pilgrimage. There's a beautiful little book out there by Lauren Artris called Walking a Sacred Path, which looks at the discipline of walking a labyrinth as a spiritual practice. Some of us will have a labyrinth in our churches. Some of us won't. If you don't, I hope you will entertain the idea of introducing it to the parish in a prayer garden or something like that, because they're easily made. I mean, all you need are some river rocks. Walking a pilgrimage, particularly through a labyrinth, there are three principles: the principle of purgation, illumination, and communion. Purgation is divine detox. When you start on the journey, surrender all the worry, the anxiety, the frustration, the fear, the doubt, the despair that you've picked up before you enter into that journey of walking the labyrinth. And pastors carry these things with us all the time. Do you pray to drop them when you're walking in the hospital door? Do you pray not to carry them into the hospital waiting room? Where we go, we're always going to have these things with us. They're our baggage. They were the baggage for Pilgrim in Pilgrim's Progress. How do we leave them behind? The second principle is that of illumination. When you start on the pilgrimage, when you walk into the labyrinth, have yourself a verse, a Bible verse, or a promise, or an attribute of God, or even just a word, whether it's hope or love or just something to contemplate and allow God to illumine the meaning of that verse or that promise or that attribute or that word, that sacred word. Allow God to illuminate that, to brighten it for you, so that by the journeys in through the labyrinth, you've gained something, an insight. But most importantly, the principle of communion, leaving what David Zimmerman calls Meville and entering Heville. Surrendering yourself in this journey of following in the way of Christ, which ultimately is the way to Golgotha. It ultimately is the taking up your cross. How can you leave yourself behind in this trip and enter into a fellowship with God that is your whole reason for being? A labyrinth is a beautiful way to do this. So hopefully you'll entertain the idea of encouraging your parish to even create one. There are a variety of plans online you can get, and like I said, just $1,000 load of river rock, and you've got yourself a labyrinth. Pastors, if you haven't caught on already, need to think quite seriously about how we travel and why we need a vacation. We've already talked a little bit about busyness. Kierkegaard, in his Concluding Unscientific Postscript, wrote, "The most ludicrous of all ludicrous things, it seems to me, is to be busy in the world. To be a man who is brisk at his meals and brisk at his work. What, after all, do these busy bustlers achieve? Are they not just like the woman who, in a flurry because the house was on fire, rescued the fire tongs? With all of our emphasis as pastors on work, what are we missing? Kierkegaard would say that it's our common calling to become who we are, to grow into the loving and productive selves that God intends us to be. The baptismal calling, which is the foundation of your life as a pastor, is a gift and a task. That is why there are vows at your baptism. You are being asked to do certain things. Grace will free you for that task. It empowers us to attend to the relationships we have with others and the relationship we have with God. Grace, and I know this is not something a lot of people want to hear, grace is the foundation for pastoral work. But it is also the freedom not to work. It is the freedom to Sabbath. We do not earn our salvation in our work. So as Kierkegaard writes, as for the rest, let him do his work and rejoice in it, love his wife and rejoice in her, joyfully bring up his children, love his fellow beings, and rejoice in life. This, folks, is why pastors who are too busy to take a vacation are just simply too busy. We need that time apart, in a place apart, to remind ourselves we're following God. Wherever you go, you will find God already there, if you just have the eyes to look. Visio Divina is a practice. We haven't talked about it yet, but it's a practice that Christians do. It's a spiritual discipline where we learn to hone our eyes in what we see. Just like Lectio Divina is to hone our ears in what we read, Visio is to train our eyes in what we see. I want you to spend some time with this image from Henry Ossawa Tanner, Christ and his disciples on the Bethany Road. Pause this video. Spend some time contemplating it. Ask God to show you what you need to see. And once you see it, thank God for what he has shown you and jot it down. Because when we come back together, we're going to do this again. And I want to see what you learn from God about pilgrimage based on this image. So pause this video for 10 minutes or so and just pray over that image. If you need to Google it and pull it up so you get a better look at it on your screen, do that. But pause the video for just a bit and ask God to show you what you need to see. There are 3 books out there that those who want to delve into this topic a bit more would do really well to investigate. N.T. Wright has one on Christian pilgrimage called The Way of the Lord. There's another by Phil Cosimo, The Art of Pilgrimage, and then finally The Road to Emmaus by Jim Forrest. All 3 of these are great books. If you want to study pilgrimage a bit more as a spiritual discipline, these are the resources to turn to first. There are many, many others, but these are the 3 I would recommend for you as you begin. As we go forward, there's going to be some questions and comments and confusion, so bring those to class with you so we can go over what it is that you hear.